I ask you all to take everything that both my parents say about me with a grain of salt, because they are naturally biased. So, this morning I'm going to talk to you guys about something that all of us face nearly every day, and that's suffering. Tragedy happens every day across the world. There's natural disasters, there's domestic violence, shootings. It just goes on. And the question that a lot of believers and non-believers alike grapple with is the question of why. Why did God allow this? And it's not a new question. This question's been around since the dawn of man, when suffering first happened. In the Old Testament, Job struggled greatly and asked the question why. The writers of the Psalms, and in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, the Holocaust, when AIDS first became an epidemic, genocide in Rwanda. It goes on, and then it carried over into the century that we're in now with 9/11. Just 1 year into the new century, and we already had a big world-shaking event, and it continues today. And several years ago, there was a survey that was posited that asked the question: if you could ask God any one question, what would it be? And the number one response was, why is there suffering in the world? So everyone asked this question, and if you haven't, then you definitely will. John 16:33, like my father just read, Jesus said, "You will have suffering in this world." It's not a question of may. It's a question of when. It's going to happen. It's a promise. If you were to ask me, as a believer, why has God allowed there to be a school shooting almost every week in 2018, the only honest answer I can give is I don't know. We don't have all the answers. We don't have God's mind. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, we're told, "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity." And that "but then" is not just the snap of a finger. We're not just going to overnight know all the answers. It comes with time. It comes with growing and understanding God's purpose for us. So someday we will see, but right now things are foggy because we can't understand with our finite perspective. And frankly, people that are suffering, people that are really feeling that hurt, they don't need some deep theological treatise. If you've ever been suffering and somebody comes to you to try to solve your problem with an answer, it's not always well received. We don't want that. We don't need that. We want to be understood. We want to be held. We want to be cared about. Still, it's really important to grapple with the question of why. And even though we can't fully understand everything, I believe that there are some things that we can think of that will kind of light our way as we're walking the path to comfort us and give us a little bit of peace. I'm going to give you a little bit of analogy. When I was younger, we did a lot of road trips. We did a lot of traveling. We lived in Florida and then South Carolina, Georgia, and Texas. So we did a lot of driving. And all our families back east, and so whenever we would take a trip out to visit them, we wouldn't fly, we would usually drive. And so as a child, I spent a lot of time in the backseat of a car. And I remember one occasion we were actually coming back from Florida to Texas, and it was a long drive. We made it in one trip. We didn't usually stop. And so that's a near day-long trek. And we were a little over halfway, maybe nearing the end, probably somewhere around Louisiana. And it started to storm. And it was already nighttime. It was dark. And it was one of those storms that even in the daylight, you dread driving through because the rain was so heavy, you couldn't even see the road. Cover that with the darkness, and it's just terrifying to drive. And I distinctly remember my mom being extremely terrified. And we continued to drive. And as a kid, I was looking out the window. I would usually watch, all the trees pass by, the other cars, but I couldn't see anything. So even I was a little frightened. And finally, we ended up coming up on a truck that he must have had like those fog headlights, because he was going at a deliberate pace. He was really, really cutting through. And when we came up on his taillights, we were a little comforted to know that if as long as we followed behind him, we would be okay. We wouldn't be drifting lanes. We wouldn't be running off the road. And so we started to follow those taillights. And so what I'm going to present to you guys today is 5 biblical taillights for us to follow when the question of why in the midst of our suffering happens. So the first taillight I wanted to go through is that God is not the creator of evil and suffering. And this kind of automatically answers the question, why didn't God create a world without suffering? He did. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31 reads, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So where did it come from? And God has existed from eternity past as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in a perfect unity of love. So love is the highest value. And when God created us, of course, he wanted us to experience that love. But to give us the ability to love, he had to give us free will to decide whether to love or not. Why? Because love involves a choice. I'm sure when your kids were younger, or even when you were younger, you might have had a doll that had a pull cord or a button or something to activate them to say, I love you, for your daughter. You pull that cord and that little doll says, I love you. But did that doll really, really love you? No. It was made to say that. It had no choice. Every time that cord was pulled, it was going to say that until the batteries ran dead. And then when you pull that cord, you didn't hear anything. So real love, true love, always involves a choice. And unfortunately for us, we have abused our free will and we've chosen to reject God, which resulted originally in sin coming into the world. And some people might ask, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, couldn't he have foreseen this happening when he created man? Couldn't he have foreseen that we were going to screw up? Yeah, no doubt that he did. But most of you guys are parents, right? Didn't you understand when you were bringing children into this world that they were going to face hardships, that they were going to have opportunities to really struggle, to even reject you? And yet we chose to have kids anyways, because as much suffering as there is in the world, we also know that there is potential for tremendous love and joy. God knew we would rebel, but also that many would choose to love and follow him, which made it worth it. So as we ponder the mystery of pain and suffering, we need to be mindful that God did not create those things. The second taillight, though suffering is not good, God can use it to accomplish good. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, the Bible promises, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Notice it doesn't say that God causes the bad things to happen, only that he will cause good to emerge. Remember, we only see things dimly, so we don't always know his plan, his purpose. And God doesn't make this promise to everyone. He makes the pledge that he will take care of the bad and cause good to emerge if we're committed to following him. And some of you might say, God can't bring good out of my circumstance. The hurt has been too deep. The pain has caused too much damage. But if you doubt God's promise, listen to this. God took the very worst thing that has ever happened in history, which is the death of Jesus on a cross, the death of God on a cross. And he turned it into the very best thing that's ever happened in history, which is the opening up of heaven for everybody that believes and follows him. So if God can take the very worst circumstance imaginable and turn it into the very best situation possible, Can he not take the negative circumstances of your life and make some good come from them? Taillight number 3. The day is coming when suffering will cease and God will judge evil. If God has the power to eradicate evil and suffering, why doesn't he just do it already? I'm sure some of us have thought about that, especially in this culture that we live in. You know, we see so many things on the news, and we hear things on the radio, all this bad news, and we wonder, God's got to be coming soon, right? It's got to be the end times. Things are terrible right now. It's got to be happening soon. Why doesn't God just make it so? Well, there's a flaw built into that question. Just because he hasn't done it yet doesn't mean he's not going to do it. I'm actually an avid writer. I love to write, and I'm writing a book, and I'm not done with it. I'm about halfway finished with it. And if I let somebody read it and say, "Hey, what do you think?" and they said, "Well, it's really unresolved. You know, there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of ended. You know, actually, your book ended in the middle of a sentence. What's up with that?" You know, I would say, "Well, it's not done, so you can't really judge it based on that because I'm still writing it." You know, in other words, the story of this world is not over. So what's holding God up? One answer to that is he's actually delaying the consummation of history in anticipation that more people will put their trust in him. He's actually delaying out of love for us. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 reads, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." To me, that's evidence of a loving God, that he would care that much for us. And taillight number 4, our suffering will pale in comparison to the good things that God has in store for us. Romans chapter 8, verse 18, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." Now, these words were written by Paul, who suffered through beatings and stonings. He suffered through shipwreck, imprisonment, hunger, rejection, thirst, homelessness, far more pain than most of us are going to have to deal with, right? And this isn't to minimize any of our pain and suffering, but it does help us to take a long-term perspective. If, say, coming up next year, 2019, January 1st, you have the worst year of your life. You have a wreck, you know, and it's your fault. So, of course, your insurance is going to go up, and you've got to deal with that. And then you come to find out that you have no money. You've gone bankrupt. You know, you're really stressed. You're really struggling, and then you come down with the flu. I mean, that's a pretty bad day, right? Just piles on. And then so from January 2nd on, it gets better. You know, you get well, and you don't have any other health issues. You decide to go play the lottery for the first time in your life, and hey, you win millions and millions of dollars. So you take yourself a nice long vacation. You know, everything is just wonderful for the rest of the year. At the end of the year, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, how was your year?" You're probably going to remember that you had a bad day leading into it. You know, you're probably going to remember that day, but you're not going to base the entire year off that day, right? You're going to say, "I had a fantastic year. I had one of the greatest years of my life." Once again, this is not to deny any of our suffering. But after 300 days, 500, 1,000 years of pure bliss, and with an infinite more to come, if someone was to ask you, "How has your eternity been?" you're probably going to answer, "It's been wonderful." You're going to think back on maybe on the sufferings of life, but you're going to realize that they pale in comparison to the rest. There's a British church leader named Galvin Reid, and he tells a story of meeting a young man who had, as a child, fallen down a flight of stairs, which shattered his back and his legs. So this little boy was in and out of the hospital for his entire life. And Galvin Reed met him at the age of 17, and asked him, how old he was and how long he'd spent in the hospital, to which the boy replied he was 17 and he'd spent about 13 years of his life in the hospital. And Galvin was astonished to find out that boy thought that God was fair and just. And of course, even a pastor would hear a story like that and think, wow, this kid's, had it pretty rough. You would think that he'd be a little bit more bitter or angry. So we asked him, he said, how is it that you can believe that God is a fair and just God if you've had to deal with 13 of your young years in the hospital? And the boy said, well, God has all eternity to make it up to me. And he will. God promises a time when there will be no more crying, no more tears, no more pain and suffering. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9 says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. In the final tail light, we decide whether to turn bitter or to turn to God for peace and courage. We've all seen how suffering can cause people to distance themselves from God. You shake their fist, I can't believe that this happened and you caused this to happen, and run away. But we've also seen how it can draw people closer to God. We have different reactions. A mother who loses a child to drunk driving can turn inward in chronic rage, never-ending despair, while another who faces the same situation turns outward to help others by founding Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We make the choice to either run away from God or run to him. So what happens if we run to him? Earlier I read only part of what Jesus said in John 16:33, so I'm going to read it again. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. You will have suffering in this world. You will. But be courageous. I have conquered the world. In other words, he offers us the things that we need. Peace and courage to deal with our future. How? Because he conquered the world. Through his own suffering and death, he has deprived the world of its ultimate power over you. Suffering doesn't have the last word anymore. Death does not have the last word. God has the last word. So I'm going to go back to the story of us driving and how that kind of panned out. So we were driving behind this truck, and the storm is raging, but we stayed behind that truck, just kept driving, and eventually he led us into the next town safely. And when we got in there, it was still raining a little bit, but the rain had calmed down just enough. We could see the lights, the street lights and the storefront lights. And as we got in, a wave of comfort kind of washed over all of us in the car, because we knew we were going to be okay. In the midst of that, being a kid, I was very impressionable. And I remember looking out at the comforting lights, and we passed by one of the churches along the street. And in the rain and the light, I could see the steeple of the church, just as a cross. And it really struck me as just a comforting sight. So I once read, God's ultimate answer to suffering isn't an explanation. It's the incarnation. Suffering is a personal problem, and it demands a personal response. God isn't some distant, disinterested God. He entered into our world, and he personally experienced our pain. Are you broken? Have you been broken? Jesus was broken. Have you ever been despised, unliked? Jesus was rejected. Do you cry out that you can't take any more sometimes? Jesus was a man of constant sorrows. Have you been betrayed? Jesus was sold out by one of his closest friends. Does he descend into all of our hells, our personal sufferings? Yes, he does. Corrie ten Boom, Holocaust survivor, from the depths of a Nazi death camp, wrote these words: "No matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still." Jesus does more than just sympathize with you. Any close friend can sympathize with you. Any close friend can just be there for you. But Jesus is closer than your closest friend. Because if you put your trust in him, then he is in you. And your sufferings become his sufferings. So when tragedy strikes, because it will, when suffering comes, because it will, when you're wrestling with pain and you make the choice to run into his arms and not away, you'll discover that you'll find peace to deal with the present. You'll find courage to deal with your future. And you'll find the incredible promise of eternal life with him. Come on.
I know applause isn't something that